Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring voices from the Valley to bear on some of the most important and complex social issues of the day. Today we're going to be talking about gender identity, and I'm pleased to have with me two guests. Genny Beemyn, who's the director of the Stonewall Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Mitch Boucher, who is a faculty member in the University Without Walls at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
There's been an interesting proposal in California that is similar to Proposition 8, and it is intended to reverse recent legislation that would protect the rights of students to access to locker rooms, to bathrooms, to sports teams that align with their gender identity. Tell us what you think about the significance of this. We have parents on both sides of the issue who are saying this is a matter of parental rights. How would you frame the issue?
Well, I think that the religious right has lost largely on the issue of same-sex marriage, and increasingly I think they're moving towards this issue as sort of a way to be able to create a false panic around particularly what they see as men being able to enter women's restrooms and locker rooms to be able to harass, assault women and girls, which is really just a false pretext. Last week there was, for example, a story in the media that was just an outright lie about that situation having happened in a public school. Really, the issue is not the fear of men who are biological men going into women's restrooms or locker rooms, but really it's the trans people who are the ones who are in danger, who are the ones who are being harassed. For example, a study that was done by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, showed that 2/3 of trans youth feel unsafe in their schools, that almost all had experienced verbal harassment, and more than half had experienced physical harassment in the past year. So that's what we're really talking about, is trying to protect those youth. And in Massachusetts, we've had for more than a year now the state Board of Elementary Secondary Education issued guidelines in 2012 after the Non-Discrimination Act in Massachusetts became law, that pretty much does what California does in terms of protecting trans youth when it comes to bathrooms, locker rooms, being able to participate in sports teams, in keeping with their gender identity, as well as also talks about using the appropriate name, protecting privacy. Really a fantastic document that we're already working in Massachusetts, and I see little problems with that being done.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, what do you have to say about this proposal?
I would absolutely agree with Genny here that the thing that I'm most critically concerned about is the protection of trans students who are, subject to so much abuse and harassment in schools every day. And this bill really sends the message to trans students that they have a right to be in school, that they have a right to all of the public resources and education that are available to other students. I think that it also points to the need to critically engage with the way we think about gender and sexuality in our culture, and that our binary concepts of gender and sexuality don't hold up to the lived experiences of people. And I think that we'll see that throughout this discussion, that that's one of the major shifts that our culture needs to catch up with, that we're organized around a concept of gender and sexuality that doesn't reflect the real lives of people.
Genny, you mentioned language and how that is used to shape perceptions. Could you talk a little bit about the law and the impact of the legislation on how we refer to individuals?
Well, the language around transgender is one that is still, of course, evolving. The research that I've done, people literally had hundreds of different terms they used to describe their gender identity, which really makes a mockery of having forms that ask sex, M, or F. And I think that the language is what trips up some people, because they have a perception that a trans woman is basically a guy in a dress. And so they have this idea that someone's going to be entering a women's locker room or women's bathroom who really is identified and looking very male. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about individuals who very strongly identify and have since very early in life as female, who are presenting female, who look very female, be able to use facilities that make the most sense for them. Because imagine that person trying to go into a men's bathroom or men's locker room and what kind of situation that's going to bring for them in terms of being assaulted, being harassed. So it really, the people don't have a grasp of what we're talking about here in terms of presentation, in terms of the language and what that means for individual lives.
Mm-hmm. And Mitch, you talked about gender not being this binary, but more of a continuum. Mm-hmm. And so how do the ways in which we use language reinforce or reinscribe the notion that it is indeed a binary when you want to argue against that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, I mean, all of our cultural landscape, including language and institutions, really reinforce this concept that there are two biological sexes and two genders that culturally coincide, so that male is a man or a boy and female is a girl or a woman. And in fact, there's intersex children, plenty of intersex children that trouble that binary on a physiological level, and then there are transgender people who have numerous identities in between that spectrum. And very often what comes to attention is transsexuality, but for some transsexual people, this binary fits for their gender identity, but for many trans people, the binary doesn't quite reflect our identities. And so I think that it's important just to constantly be opening up our ways of thinking about gender and sexual identity.
You've both talked about bullying and harassment in the schools, but it takes place in the workplace as well. Mm-hmm. There was a recent South Dakota case, which was a landmark case, in which a woman was awarded $50,000, which was the maximum award for being fired after she revealed that she was going to transition from male to female. Tell us what employers can do to create safe working environments and to raise awareness around issues of gender identity.
Well, many of the same issues happen in the workplace as do in the school systems. So I think that trans people have all of the protections that other people have in the workplace, and that includes use of bathrooms that are appropriate, not having to go to a segregated bathroom that's only for them or that's in a different office where they have to walk up 3 flights of stairs, being treated appropriately in the workplace, using the correct pronouns of the person, not being subject to harassment, of course not being fired for coming out as trans or transitioning on the job. So I think that, just creating an environment, just like the message of AB 1266 in California, sends the message to trans students that they have a place here. I think that employers can really set the stage for that as well in their workplaces by just making it impossible for people to be harassing people at work. And one more thing is that these are very interrelated, because when students are driven out of schools by bullying and harassment, it starts a downward spiral for them, so that they end up dropping out of high school, unemployed, and then having a harder time getting employment and not being able to get jobs. They end up in the street or in an underground economy that then brings them into the prison system, and it's a real downward spiral. And so I think that both of these issues show promise in a changing landscape, which is moving in a new direction, and I see hope in that. But there's still a long way to go.
I would just add to that from a policy perspective, employers should have gender identity and non-discrimination policy, should be providing medical coverage for transitioning individuals, covering hormones and medical care, surgeries, also having transgender issues be part of Title IX trainings, part of anti-harassment trainings, and treated it really as seriously as sexual harassment as many employers do, because they're afraid of being sued by being held accountable. And I think that the same issue is coming up more and more. As you mentioned, the South Dakota case, more and more trans people are taking action and suing when they're mistreated at work, recognizing that it's the employer's responsibility to create a supportive climate, or at least certainly not allow a hostile one to be maintained. So I think we're going to see more and more litigation and more employers being put on the hot seat there. We just had this year, you mentioned that case, and Title IX being invoked. You also have a case, a settlement that came up with a school system in California, Arcadia, where the government said very explicitly that trans students are covered under Title IX, and that institutions of higher education and K-12 have to be protecting trans students. And I think it's going to be a really landmark decision in terms of changing the landscape on the K-12 and college level.
Mm-hmm. Certainly these legal cases can help serve as an impetus for bringing forward legislation that will protect the rights of transgender individuals. At the same time, more than 90% of transgender people report being harassed in the workplace, and they fear going to legal authorities because there's further harassment at that level. Mm-hmm. So it would seem that we need to have training in the legal system as well. Any ideas on how to approach that?
That's a big issue. I think that society has a learning curve to go when it comes to trans, and I think the legal system in particular is needing to catch up with where people are. We're starting to see more and more laws be put in place supporting trans people. It's still very slow. We only have 17 states that offer protection for trans people, so they don't face discrimination when it comes to employment, housing, public accommodation. So we're still talking about a small number of states that even have gone that far to protect it. And we're getting some good case law. The government has been very fantastic in terms of its Title IX work and issuing missives about what schools and employers should be doing to protect people based upon gender identity as well as sexual orientation. But I think the courts really haven't caught up with it. We don't have a lot of good case law yet, mm-hmm. and a lot of this has never been litigated. Like I'm asked all the time, well, what is the legality of this? And I say, well, this is what I think, but it really has not been litigated yet, mm-hmm. so we don't really know how that might turn out.
Yeah, I think that we can learn a lot from the feminist movement around issues of sex discrimination and sexual harassment, and learn from the educational initiatives that feminist women have pushed in the workplace in mm-hmm. order to create equal conditions. And I think that trans people can really learn from that. There's also a lot of trans law organizations. There's a Sylvia Rivera Law Project in New York that does excellent work in representing mm-hmm. trans people. There's GLAD has done great work, Transgender Law Center. So there's a lot of organizations now that are working to create that litigation that will give those founding cases.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, you mentioned trans individuals in prisons, mm-hmm. and we know that there was a flurry of media activity around the Private Manning case. Mm-hmm. Talk about how the media frames transgender people and issues surrounding transgender individuals and the impact that has on attempts to make progress toward human rights.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a large variation in media coverage of trans people. Sometimes, on the one hand, media can be very enabling, right? So social media, internet has done huge things for the trans community and parents of trans children in terms of building support networks and in all of the other ways that social media can call attention to certain cases. Mainstream media, I think that there's a large variation in representations of trans people. Historically, trans people have been regularly represented as kind of as liars, as thieves, as falsely presenting themselves, maybe a little bit crazy. But that is really, it's starting to change. Just like all of these, the legal landscape and the schools and media is starting to change as well, and we're seeing more different representations of trans people. I think Jenny's going to talk about Laverne Cox a little bit. So
yeah, but just the whole Chelsea Manning case was really interesting when she came out and said, I want to be referred to by Chelsea and by she. I was just amazed by the amount of attention that garnered. I got more calls from the media about that than I've gotten about anything. So it really, it struck a chord, and for a lot of media, that was kind of when they first like, oh, there's some issues here we should be talking about, and because the Manning case was such a headline-grabbing story that they really wanted to follow up on that. But it's so disappointing, though, to see that so much of the media, even places that tend to be more liberal, like NPR, New York Times, were not initially referring to her as she and as Chelsea, and we're doing kind of wiggling around that and saying that this is how the person wanted to refer to herself. We're going to still call her he. So, but thankfully they eventually got that figured out and realized, okay, they got a little bit of training about appropriate terminology to be using around transgender. And I think in the long run, it did help to get more people to understand what exactly we were talking about when we refer to transgender, and people were transitioning and using appropriate names and pronouns. So I think in the end, it did something good, but I think that the media really didn't get it, and I think that really showed just how much the media itself needs to be educated on these issues, because the media is just so critical to how people perceive things and their recognition of things. I remember when Chaz Bono went on Dancing with Stars, and how big that was, and which that's not my kind of thing, but how that really put trans people in the spotlight in a way that had never happened before. That people were turning in and seeing this person dance who happened to be trans, and how that helped normalize why some people on the radical right were so upset by that, because it's making trans people just like anyone else. And oh my God, we can't have that happen, God forbid. But this generation, we're seeing huge changes take place because of people like Chaz Bono, like particularly Laverne Cox, who Mitch just referred to, being someone who's out as a trans person and being successful as an actor, being able to be in a leading show, Orange is the New Black, and become very popular, and people accept her for who she is, and really making it possible for trans people to actually, for the first time, really be able to play trans people on screen, as well as hopefully in time be able to play non-trans characters as well. We brought Laverne to UMass last week, and I thought we'd get a good crowd. I was just overwhelmed by the fact that we exceeded capacity in a room, had 700 people there, and had turned several hundred people away. I never would have thought that, and that never would have happened 5 years ago, but it shows just how the landscape is changing thanks to having some visibility in the media. Because we bring trans people all the time to campus, and like, if we're lucky, we'll get 50 people at something. So having someone who's like a celebrity, who they recognize, who has a certain popularity, really brings this issue home. And she had great things to say about being trans and educating people in the audience. So it was a really fabulous event, and really went a long way, I think, to helping people who are not trans, which was almost everyone in the audience, better understand trans issues.
Well, congratulations on that, Mitch.
Along those lines, even with such a landmark representation as Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black, she is represented as being selfish in terms of her wanting to transition, that she shouldn't feel in any way betrayed when her wife or ex-wife, wants to pursue other relationships, or and also she's in there for stealing money for hormones. And so once again, we're seeing trans people represented as a thief, as selfish, putting their own needs in front of the needs of a family, which is also a typical type of thing that we see in media representations.
Right. Or also as a comic figure.
As a comic figure, sure.
Yes.
Yep. Right.
So the subject of ridicule on late night talk shows, but also in the characterizations, it's a kind of neo-minstrelsy applied to a different group. So you mentioned young children as well. And I want you to say a little bit about what advice you would give parents. I've seen a couple of shows recently and read a few articles about parents whose children are identifying very early in a way that goes against social norms. They are worried about the psychological harm that could come from denying those proclamations and feelings, and yet they're aware of the the bullying, the abuse that children can take by going against these norms. So what would you recommend?
There's a great book that just came out by a woman by the name of Lori Duran, who had a blog called Raising My Rainbow, which is now the name of the book, which is about raising now a 6-year-old child whom she refers to as CJ, who from a very young age identified as gender nonconforming, and the struggles that they went through as a family to raise a child who is gender nonconforming. And basically her movement from recognizing the best interest of themselves, the parents, versus the best interest of that child, and recognizing that a lot of what they were doing in terms of trying to restrict the gender behavior that was more feminine of this male assigned child was really not to protect them, the child I mean, but protect the parents, and recognizing that the child needed to be who the child was, and the dangers of not allowing that to happen. Because so many people whom I've interviewed for my research who are much older talk about, especially if they were male assigned identified as female, how their parents basically stifled that, and how that really ruined their lives in a lot of ways. Forced them to repress who they were, to go into really a lot of really awful behaviors in terms of drugs and alcohol and some attempted suicide. So really, I think need to let the children decide where to go with that, let the children lead, follow their example and what their needs are, and try to protect them the best you can from bullying. And really, it's more the parents' uncomfortability more than the child's uncomfortability a lot of times. Because there are laws to protect child, who are harassed or discriminated against, and so really the parents need to think what's best for the children.
Good.
Yes, I would agree that what trans children need more than anything is a supportive environment and a place where they can explore without shame, become ask interested questions, let the child lead. Give the child space to explore who they are. They may change as they grow older. They may not. But following that child and really just seeing yourself as a guide to protect and to create a space where that child can be protected from the harassment that he or she is going to be facing in the social world all the time. And the other thing is to get support. Parents need support for themselves. They need to see, because they'll be taking criticism too from other parents who feel like they're indulging their children. And so it's really important to get support, find out that you're not the only one out there, your child is not the only child like this, and that there's wonderful support systems through the internet especially.
And what about gender reassignment surgery? You have a teen who says, I'm ready for the surgery. Would you allow the teen to make the decision in the way that you would allow a teen to make any serious medical decision?
Well, we're fortunate now to be in a position where we have gender blockers, so, hormone blockers, so that people can postpone that to where they're in a place where they feel they can make that decision and go through the puberty that is right for them. And so you don't have to have, because puberty gets younger and younger, it seems, every year. So we don't have to have like an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old making that decision about transitioning. We can have that person be on hormone blockers for several years, and when they get to a more better place, be able to make that kind of decision. But we have been doing this work for a lot of years, so we have a good sense of, in terms of gender therapists, can tell when we're talking about someone who really is transgender versus someone who may, for whatever reason, feel like that is who they are now, but might change in the future.
Great. Tell us a bit about best practices on college and university campuses, since you're both members of the university community.
Wow, okay. This is the work I've been doing, writing and speaking the last 15 years, so I can go on forever, but just very briefly, I think it's important that institutions have gender identity in their non-discrimination policy. We only have about 700 colleges that even taken that basic step, which is only about 1/6 of the colleges that have done so. But this year, we're seeing a much more rapid increase in that. We're seeing women's colleges, we're seeing historically black colleges do that. So it's a really fantastic increase in the last couple of years when it comes to that. Having gender-inclusive bathrooms and locker rooms that are private facilities, that people who want to have a space that we're not going to be observe other people can do so, and having policies that allow people to use the bathroom and locker rooms that keep their gender identity to provide hormones and surgery as part of student health insurance, giving students the chance to use a different name than their legal name on institutional documents so that a student is not outed by having a professor, for example, read the roll on the first day of class, giving students a chance to change the gender marker as well so that the college recognizes them for who they feel themselves to be, and then also providing gender inclusive housing so that students can have a roommate or suite mate or apartment mate of whatever gender that they choose so that they are in a comfortable living situation and don't have to worry about being harassed in their own home. And about 150 colleges had done that, so that's again a very small number, but we're increasing very rapidly when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. The concern I hear most is with respect to inclusivity of all sorts, and so if you have conservative Christians or Muslim students who are proscribed from living with someone of the opposite gender, and then there's a transitioning person, they say, well, what about our rights? What about inclusivity for us? So how do we respond to that?
Well, it's, like, for example, no one says to someone else, you have to have a roommate of this particular gender. It's all sign in, it's all interested students. So it's an accommodation. The same sort of issues come up when we're talking about conservative Christian students or Orthodox Jewish students or Muslim students. Their needs are coming as well. No one's being told they have to live with a certain person in their environment. It's more of giving everyone kind of a chance to be comfortable and safe and feel included.
Fantastic. Any last comments?
Well, I'd just like to emphasize that, a lot of the topics we're talking about today are addressing people that, for the most part already have a certain amount of social and economic privilege, getting into colleges and employment situations and things like that. And, I'm always very aware that I don't really represent the trans community at large. I often feel very much like an anomaly in that I have certain privileges and economic and educational privileges that the vast majority of trans people don't have. And so particularly trans women of color who are, I did a quick very cursory Google search this morning on trans women of color and the number of murders and homicides that are taking place. And since July, when Diamond Williams was killed, I found 8 in a very quick Google search, 8 since July of trans women of color that are being murdered on the streets every day. And so, I feel like, it's just always really important to keep that in mind, that there's many, many, many trans people, the majority of trans people are really marginalized economically and socially.
Right. And to add to that, you're talking mostly about this country, but around the world, trans women of color, face huge discrimination, and I think it's 80 people were killed just in the first 4 months of this year who are trans people around the world that we know of. And of course, there are many more we don't know of, and almost all of those were trans women of color from very poor backgrounds and who didn't have a chance to escape from that poverty and such.
And when we speak about media representation, I'd really love to see more media representation of the homicides that are taking place. That's where I would really like to see more media coverage rather than on the sexual reassignment issues or issues around surgery and hormones. It's just a very small segment of the issues that face trans people.
Thank you so much for your insights and your extraordinary contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.